The current protests in Iran are seen by many as the largest ever faced by the regime. The demonstrations have already lasted for more than 2 weeks and continue to spread. Today, the acts reach all 31 provinces of the country and hundreds of cities. Sources indicate that the situation is critical, reporting that some locations are already under the total control of the protesters. But why are these demonstrations so different from others in the past? And why might we be watching the final days or weeks of the Ayatollah's regime? The world is witnessing a perfect storm where internal exhaustion meets a total loss of external deterrence. This isn't just another protest, it's a structural breakdown of the state's authority. The immediate trigger for all of this was economic. Everything started after the collapse of the rial and the accelerated worsening of the cost of living. There was a direct impact from new exchange rate policy measures, added to the feeling that the population was paying the bill for everything. This includes the weight of sanctions, isolation, and corruption. In addition, there was anger over the priority given by the regime to its missile and nuclear weapons programs. Finally, there was the massive effort to maintain dozens of terrorist groups spread across Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Gaza, and Yemen. For decades, billions of dollars that should have been invested in Iranian infrastructure were diverted to fund the axis of resistance. While the people faced breadlines, the regime was busy exporting its ideology through proxy wars and ballistic technology. Therefore, what began as a protest for better living conditions evolved into a protest of legitimacy. Protesters are not just asking for economic change. Now they are openly calling for regime change. The Iranian government's response followed its usual practice of repression and violence. These measures are now being applied with maximum intensity. Human rights organizations and videos captured on site prove the use of live ammunition by security forces against the population. The death toll is the most sensitive data. The regime itself restricts information through communication blackouts, which makes full confirmation of the data difficult. Estimates vary widely. They range from a few hundred dead and thousands detained to numbers exceeding 6,000 dead and tens of thousands of prisoners. Perhaps one of the most symbolic images of this crisis is the attempt to erase the country from the internet. The national blackout has already lasted for more than 100 hours. There are severe restrictions on foreign websites and any type of external communication. In despair, Iranians are trying to turn to satellite communication systems, such as Elon Musk's Starlink. It was even announced that the service would be free until February. However, the regime is also hunting down these antennas. Drones fly over the roofs of buildings and houses in search of the equipment. In addition, electronic systems work constantly to interfere with the signal. This electronic warfare includes the use of high-powered jammers and localized GPS spoofing to confuse even basic navigation. The regime is treating its own cities like a battlefield, deploying the same technology used against foreign drones to silence its own citizens. This serves two purposes at the same time: to prevent the coordination of protests and to make it difficult for evidence of abuses to leave the country. But why is this current wave of protests so different from previous ones? Iran has already experienced strong cycles of protests, such as in 2009, 2017, 2019, and 2022. But the regime, through violence and repression, has always survived. Now, however, many analysts say it is different for 3 main reasons, starting with the economy. The economy is not just bad, it has authentically collapsed, now affecting all social classes. The second reason is that this time, the protests have spread across the entire map. Despite having a massive machine of repression at its disposal, the regime is unable to act with full force in all locations. The government had to choose where to act, and because of this, some areas were completely taken over by protesters. And finally, there is the geopolitical reason, with the Iranian regime going through a critical moment after the 12-day war. This conflict, which took place between June 13th and 24th, 2025, resulted in the destruction of a large part of Iran's air defenses by Israel. This led to a situation that was unimaginable just a few months ago, with Israel obtaining air superiority and total freedom of movement over the capital, Tehran. The American attack, which severely affected the Iranian nuclear program, also served to further weaken the regime. Infrastructure at Natanz and Fordo, once thought to be impenetrable, proved vulnerable to modern bunker-buster technology. This demonstrated that the regime's red lines were no longer a barrier to Western and Israeli military action. All of this transmitted a clear signal of humiliation, weakness, and incompetence to a large part of Iranian society. The demonstrations gained strength and dimension precisely because of this perception. According to many analysts and international leaders, such as German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, the Iranian regime may be in its final days and weeks. Merz, who assumed office in May 2025, has taken a much firmer stance than his predecessors, signaling that Europe is no longer willing to tolerate Tehran's regional destabilization. Many countries are calling the regime's legitimacy into question, arguing that depending on violence to stay in power is a sign that control is over. The current deep economic crisis and the perception that there is no quick fix for this crisis have created a critical scenario. Added to this, the national scale of the protests, the brutal response of the regime, and the shock after the 12-day war make this moment much more serious than others in the past. And we still have to count on external pressure, with President Trump signaling his willingness to attack Iran if the massacre of protesters continues. This potential maximum pressure 2.0 creates a dilemma for the Iranian generals. Obey orders to shoot their own people and risk a foreign intervention, or stand down and let the regime fall. But we cannot forget that for a regime to fall, in addition to demonstrations, sectors of the armed forces and security forces must abandon the government. And this is something that has not happened so far, with Tehran still maintaining total control over the military and its forces of repression. Without weapons, or without the military on their side, protesters can make noise and attract international attention and outrage, but they can hardly bring down a regime, especially one like the Iranian regime. Therefore, this point, attracting commanders and military units to the side of the protesters, is crucial for the fall of the regime. But this is something that, as I said, we have not seen yet. It is undeniable that the context in which Iran finds itself now is very different from the context of past demonstrations. And a regime that bases its legitimacy on brute force and violence cannot afford to look weak. When the regime tries to achieve this through pressure, repression, and extreme violence, it may gain time, but it also increases the moral and political cost of the system itself. The Ayatollahs still fully control their military and their forces of repression. But if internal violence continues to increase and if international pressure tightens, the scenario could change drastically. This could even involve American attacks against strategic targets of the regime. In this case, Friedrich Merz's prediction may be correct. We may now be facing the final days or weeks of one of the most brutal and oppressive regimes of today. Considering the economic collapse and the military shock we have seen so far, the question remains: do you believe the Iranian regime will be able to stifle this new wave of protests through brute force? Or will international support and internal desertions make 2026 the year of the definitive fall of the theocracy? If you want to fully understand how all of this began and see the detailed analysis of this collapse, watch the video I prepared about the nation on the brink of the abyss. There, I explain the details of the uprising that took over the 31 provinces and the international reactions that are changing the fate of the Middle East.